You know from the Watch Me First video that these demonstrations do not repeat the important details of the context and progress of Christy Jackson and her colleagues' project in Chapter 9. So we assume you've read that chapter, and I'll start with just a high-level refresher of the project by talking through the stages of the diagram on page 182. The first and second stages involve the team analysing the first round of interview transcripts. First of all, they planned the first round of analysis of the first set of interviews. This involved generating an initial plan, piloting this plan, and testing coder reliability. In other words, reviewing how the different team members had coded the first few documents to ensure as much consistency in coding as possible. The second stage involved conducting the descriptive coding on all the first round interview transcripts and planning and preparing the first report. The third and fourth stages involved the team analysing the second and third round of interview transcripts. The third stage was a thematic analysis in which the coding structure was again planned and piloted. The descriptive coding was undertaken on the second round interview transcripts, as a result of which the meaning of learning was identified. A second report was then written. The fourth stage began with another round of planning for the critical incident analysis of the third round interview transcripts, after which the third research report was prepared. The fifth and sixth stages involved discourse analysis of the fourth round of interview transcripts and the synthesis of all the prior stages. The fifth stage involved discursive coding of the fourth round of interview transcripts, again after planning how this would be undertaken amongst the team. All the prior stages of analysis were then integrated, so that in the sixth stage, analytic synthesis was reached and the final report was planned and prepared. Christy has created one video per stage of the project to bring to life how it was accomplished in NVivo. You can refer to Chapter 9 for the details of the phases of work in each stage. Each stage video is in a number of parts. So now Christy begins with discussing the first stage.
Hello everyone, my name is Christy Jackson, and I was one of the researchers in this violence prevention initiative that is part of the NVivo book. And I have right now a project open where I have documents like the research brief and some sample transcripts. Here's a list of all of my transcripts, and I also have some nodes or coding categories, and this is our first round of descriptive level coding. I'll go back to this research brief just as a little tip. You can have some mission creep in your projects. And so bringing in your protocol, the design, the desired outcomes in terms of products, those are all helpful to bring in addition to your interview data, for instance, because you can always go back to it, especially if years go by and you want to come back to that study and rethink some things. Okay, so before I go into our first stage here, and I'm referring to table 9.3 in the chapter, I want to show you in Excel where we started. We actually started here and as a team met to come up with coding structures. We did this based on the fact that we all had conducted interviews in different communities. There were 26 different communities, so we had quite a bit of data. And this allowed us to come together and talk through potential coding structure. The principal investigator helped pull this together after we met as a team, and then we reviewed it a second time after the meeting to make sure it still resonated and to provide another round of suggestions. We independently reviewed 4 transcripts, and I reviewed 2 transcripts from people I interviewed and 2 transcripts from people that I didn't interview to help balance that insider-outsider perspective. And then I was able to use this table to code and to provide final suggestions, and then that went back to the PI before our next meeting. So in our second meeting, we constructed this project. In this project, we had, again, our descriptive coding structures, some sample transcripts, and we created this project shell so that we could distribute it and code simultaneously but independently later. And there are two things I want to mention about the shell of a project. It had the coding structure in it, at least to the degree we'd agreed on it so far. And it also had the sources. And I've highlighted some of the sources here to give you a little tip about naming schemes. What you'll see in our naming scheme is we start with a letter, and that represents one of the 26 communities that we worked in. The next character after that letter is a number, and that represents the wave of data collection. So wave 1, wave 2, wave 3. Then we have another letter that represents the role of the person in that community. This was a director. The next one was a staff person. And then finally, we ended with the initials of the interviewer. So I conducted these first two interviews. What this does for you is when you open up any node to see the data inside of it, it will stack alphabetical by file name. And so what's nice is when you open up a node, you'll see all the data for a particular community, and then you'll also see it by wave and by position or by role. You don't have to do this, and there are other tools I'll show you later on that help compare subgroups, like if you wanted to compare how directors and staff people talked about something across the database. There are some other tools that do that, but your naming scheme can help give you an initial look at the data in a way that facilitates some analysis and thinking. So at our first team meeting, we brought in these files, we had our naming scheme, and we also had our initial round of descriptive codes. And at the end of that meeting, we made copies of this project and distributed it. We had 2 different copies of this project. Now, while I just showed you an example of all of these naming schemes, I'm going to go back in time. I created a little subfolder to show you what this was like right as we got started. As we got started, even though we had a naming scheme and we imported files, we created 2 copies of 2 transcripts. So here's A1DKJ, and there was a team, a pair of researchers that was going to code this. And then in a separate project, we had the same file, but team B was going to code it. So in the 2 copies of the project, team A had 2 transcripts, and team B had 2 transcripts. Then when we merged the projects together, this is what it looked like.